The desert is where everything seems to die. Yet it was there, in the silence between the wind and the dust, that a voice broke through the impossible. Moses was no longer a prince, nor a warrior. He was just a weary man, hiding from his own story. 40 years had passed since he fled Egypt. 40 years of silence, hoping his past would forget him. But God does not forget those he once called. A bush burned before him, yet was not consumed. The fire was real, but the bush remained intact. That image wasn't just a miracle, it was a mirror. Like him, the bush was ablaze, but refused to be destroyed. "Moses, Moses," the voice called him twice, and he answered, like someone who no longer knew who he was. "Here I am." It was the beginning of something he never asked for. God was choosing him not for comfort, but for confrontation. Not for glory, but for battle. An impossible mission: return to Egypt, confront Pharaoh, and set an entire people free. With empty hands and a soul full of fear, Moses trembled. It wasn't just the fire consuming him now, it was the weight of a calling he never wanted. It was the feeling that God had chosen the wrong man. But what God saw in Moses, he couldn't even see in himself. And maybe that is the greatest mystery of faith. Why does God choose the weak for such great tasks? In this video, you will walk through the soul of Moses, not as a hero, but as a man. You'll understand how fear can walk side by side with faith. You'll feel the weight of every doubt, every refusal, every step taken toward the impossible. And more than that, you'll discover that unshakable faith isn't born out of strength, but out of obedience in the midst of fear. Moses will not be presented as an untouchable icon, but as someone who fell, resisted, hesitated, and yet was used by God. Throughout this journey, you'll witness the spiritual conflict of someone who hears God but can't believe in himself, the tension of leading while the heart still wrestles with doubt, the moment the sea parts, not by might but by obedience, the lonely climb to a mountain no one else dared ascend, the breaking of the tablets and of the soul, and finally, the legacy of a man who never entered the promised land, but lives eternally in God's memory. This isn't just a biblical account, it's a calling, because if God spoke to Moses in a desert, he still speaks to those who feel forgotten, and if he used a man who was afraid, he just might be getting ready to use you too. The calling had been made, the fire had spoken, but in the face of the mission, Moses didn't rise like a warrior, he withdrew like a wounded man. His mouth, once used to lead armies and converse with princes, now hesitated even to answer God. The unshakable faith many admire in Moses wasn't born ready. It was forged in the struggle between the voice of God and the echo of fear within him. "Who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh?" That was his first reaction. It wasn't modesty, it was insecurity carved deep into his soul. The man who once walked the halls of a palace couldn't even imagine going back. God had promised to be with him, but Moses' mind kept insisting, "I am not enough." And how could it be any different? The past still hurt. The blood of the Egyptian he had killed was still on his hands and in his memory. The failure of trying to save his people in his own strength still haunted him. How could he trust that this time would be any different? But God didn't offer an explanation or comfort. He gave a firm promise, "I will be with thee." It was no longer about what Moses could do, but about what God would do through him. Even so, fear didn't surrender so easily. Moses raised another wall. "But what if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" The people's doubt became his preemptive failure. So God showed him signs. The staff that turned into a serpent, the hand that became leprous, the water that turned to blood. But even miracles couldn't silence his deepest insecurity. Then came the confession that laid bare his soul. "O my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." Moses looked at his limitation and saw it as a sentence. But God looked at that same limitation and saw the gateway to his glory. "Who hath made man's mouth?" God asked. It wasn't a rebuke, It was a revelation. Moses' weakness wasn't an obstacle. It was the perfect stage for the power of God to be revealed. This is where true faith begins to be born, not from self-confidence, but from surrender. Still, Moses tried to run, send someone else. But God was angered, not from wounded pride, but from misunderstood love. He knew who Moses could become. He knew that within that insecure man lived the deliverer of a nation. And even after all the resistance, God offered help. Aaron, his brother, would speak when he could not, because even when we doubt, God is already preparing the way. How many times are we like Moses, called by God, touched by something greater, but paralyzed by our failures, our traumas, our limitations? How often do we look at the impossible and say, "I'm not capable"? But God's answer still echoes, "I will be with you." He doesn't choose the ready, he prepares the chosen. The unshakable faith we admire in Moses wasn't born on an altar. It was born in dry ground, where tears and doubts also fell. If this battle between calling and fear speaks to you, if at any moment you felt unworthy, unready, or unable, subscribe to this channel and leave a like, because each new story can reignite faith in weary hearts. And maybe today, God wants to use you to do that. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that it's still possible to be used by God. Be an instrument, be the answer. The obedience that began with a trembling voice is now becoming footsteps in the desert. And as Moses walks toward Egypt, something begins to change, not outside of him but within, because true faith doesn't wait to feel brave. It obeys even while fear still whispers. The journey to Egypt was a quiet one. The staff in his hand didn't carry glory, it carried responsibility. Behind him, Aaron, the voice that would speak to the people. Ahead, the empire. And in between, the tension of facing a past that had never healed. Moses, the fugitive, was returning to the place where he was once called a prince. But now he returned as the servant of an invisible God. Pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was treated as a deity. His commands shaped destinies, and even the stones of the palace trembled before his authority. To face him wasn't just bold, it was a death sentence. Yet Moses stepped in. His hands may have trembled, but his feet stood firm. And then, with whispered courage, he spoke words that would echo through generations. "Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." Pharaoh laughed. Like a god insulted by a mere insect, he scorned the command. "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." With that refusal, a confrontation began, not political, but spiritual. The throne of Egypt would be shaken by a God no one could see, but all would come to fear. The plagues followed. Water turned to blood, frogs, gnats, flies, disease on livestock, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and finally, the death of the firstborn. Each plague was more than judgment. It was a declaration of war against the gods of Egypt. One by one, the symbols of Egyptian power were brought low by a God who did not need to be seen to be known. Yet even in the face of miracles, Moses wasn't spared the weight. With every refusal from Pharaoh, his soul bled. The people complained. The Hebrews doubted, and the silence of God grew heavier by the day. To obey without visible results is a pain that slowly crushes the spirit. Still, he did not turn back, because faithfulness is not born from confirmation, it is born from conviction. Moses knew he had been sent, and even when everything screamed otherwise, he stood firm. He was no longer a prince. He was a servant, obedient and steadfast. At this point in the journey, the staff became more than a tool. It became a symbol. Every time Moses raised it, something happened. But what truly changed wasn't Egypt. It was Moses. The trembling faith had begun to take root. The hesitant voice now carried authority. The battle wasn't only against Pharaoh, it was against discouragement, against the unbelief of the people, against the inner whispers that still said, "You're not enough." But each confrontation with Egypt's throne revealed an eternal truth. When God sends, he also sustains, even when the road is long, even when the miracle delays, even when it feels like nothing is happening. Moses learned that faithfulness is not measured by the answers we receive, but by the consistency we keep. It's easy to obey when the heavens open, harder to keep going when heaven seems silent. Pharaoh's heart remained hard, but even that was part of God's strategy, because God didn't just want to free a people. He wanted the whole world to know that no empire, no deity, no name stood above his. The people couldn't see it yet, but something was changing, and it wasn't in Egypt. It was in the heart of the man who once ran away and now remained. Moses was being shaped, not by victories, but by waiting. The unshakable faith that would be remembered for generations was born in the dry ground of persistence, and the God who seemed silent was only preparing the climax, because before the deliverance would come the darkest night, and before the sea would part, fear would still have one last word. Night fell like a heavy veil over Egypt. The cries of the firstborn echoed through the streets of every city. Pharaoh, broken by grief and a sovereignty he no longer controlled, finally gave in. "Go," he said, "and take everything with you." And so a people enslaved for generations rose up and left. But their liberation wasn't quiet. It was a march of faith through the heart of the improbable. Moses led men, women, and children who had never known freedom. They carried only what they needed, and one invisible promise, that God would lead them to a land flowing with milk and honey. But the path, as so often happens with divine plans, wasn't the shortest nor the easiest. It was the most impossible. Ahead of them, the Red Sea. Behind them, the fury of a regretful Pharaoh, now charging forward with his armies. To the left and right, desert and despair. And in the middle, a people beginning to tremble again. The fear they had left behind in Egypt now caught up with them. Doubts returned like a storm. "Why did you bring us out here? It would have been better to die as slaves than to perish here." The crowd cried out, and once again Moses stood between human outcry and divine silence. He lifted his eyes. The sea didn't part. He looked behind. Pharaoh's chariots were already kicking up dust. Time was running out. Faith was being crushed. But it is exactly in that place, where no visible path remains, that God shows up. "Why do you cry to me?" said the Lord. "Tell the people to move forward." Move. Where? Into the sea. God's command didn't come with explanations. It came with direction. Moses raised the staff. The hands that once hesitated now rose with resolve. The staff touched the impossible, and the impossible yielded. The waters parted as if bowing to their creator. The seabed became a road. The wind carved a path. The people, once paralyzed by fear, now ran toward freedom. The impossible became a passage. But the real miracle wasn't just in the water, it was in the heart. It was in the choice to keep walking, even when logic screamed to stop. It was in the step taken into nothing, trusting that God would do the rest. Moses had no guarantees, only a command. And that became his greatest strength. He obeyed without seeing. As the people crossed through, Egypt pursued. Pharaoh still believed he could win, but the God who opened the way also knew how to close it. The waters that had been salvation now became judgment. The sea collapsed over chariots, horses, and riders of the empire. And that morning, the people looked back and saw something they would never forget. The bodies of their oppressors floating in the water. Fear had been defeated. Egypt would pursue them no more. The impossible path revealed an eternal truth. God doesn't remove the sea. He turns it into a road. And when there seems to be no way out, faith isn't just an option, it's the only way. The miracle was visible, but the true transformation was invisible. The people saw with their eyes. Moses saw with his heart. From that day forward, the name of the Lord was feared among the nations. But more importantly, it was revered by his own people. Now they knew, not by hearsay but by sight, that the God of Israel wasn't just a deliverer. He was a God who walks with them, even through the impossible. The sea had closed. Egypt was behind them. The people were now free, or at least free from their chains. But the greatest bondage had yet to be broken, the fear within. They still carried shackles in their souls. And God, knowing the deep wounds of his people, didn't lead them straight to the promised land. He led them to the foot of a mountain, Sinai. There, God didn't just want to set them free. He wanted to reveal himself. It wasn't about geography. It was about encounter. Not about elevation, but about inner shaking. The mountain that reached into the heavens would become the stage for something never seen before, the glory of God descending before human eyes. But before the manifestation came, the preparation. God commanded the people to purify themselves, to set themselves apart, and to keep their distance. No one could touch the mountain. No one could come near. Only one man would go up, Moses. The people saw thunder and lightning, dense clouds, a trumpet blast growing louder and louder. The ground trembled, the stones seemed to breathe, the sky darkened, and then, amid it all, God spoke. The crowd trembled. They couldn't bear the sound of the divine voice. "Speak to us yourself, Moses, and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, or we will die." It was fear, not fear of evil, but of the sacred. Glory exposed their smallness. Presence crushed their pride. They weren't ready to hear God. But Moses climbed. The mountain was a place of separation, but also of revelation. He didn't climb with strategies or strength. He climbed with spiritual obedience. He knew he wasn't worthy, but he had been called. The unshakable faith, built step by step since the burning bush, now carried him where no one else dared to go. At the summit, Moses entered the cloud. He stayed 40 days and 40 nights before the Eternal. He received commands, laws, and promises. But more than that, he came to know the character of God. While the people saw only fire and smoke, Moses heard words. While the Israelites feared destruction, Moses discovered that the God who burns also transforms. And that is the miracle in the impossible, that a flawed, limited, fragile man can go up to where the Holy One dwells and come back with a glow on his face that he himself doesn't even notice. But Sinai wasn't just a place of intimacy, it was also a place of contrast. Because while Moses feasted on glory, the people below fed on their insecurities, without their leader, without clear vision, and gripped by ancient inner fear. They returned to what they knew, idols. They asked Aaron to make them a golden calf, a visible symbol, something they could touch, control, understand. They had seen the miracle, but they still didn't understand the presence. While God was writing the words of the covenant with his own finger, the people were prostituting themselves with images of their former slavery. The contrast between the two scenes is brutal. At the summit, holiness. In the valley, decay. And Moses had to come down, with tablets in hand and a heart torn in two. Because God's calling is never just to contemplate, it is to intercede, it is to act. The mountain of fear became the most intimate place in Moses' story. There he discovered that God does not choose the perfect. He chooses the willing, and that true faith isn't satisfied with signs and wonders. It longs to know the voice behind the fire. The heavens still trembled with the presence of God. Moses descended slowly from the mountain, clutching the tablets of the covenant against his chest. They were more than stone and writing. They were the testimony of a God who had spoken, who had made a covenant, who had trusted. Moses' face, though he didn't know it, shone with the glory of that encounter. But as he neared the camp, a strange sound began to pierce the silence of Sinai. It wasn't worship. It was shouting. It was celebration. It was idolatry. The people, impatient with their leader's absence, had traded the presence of the invisible God for the image of gold they could see and touch. A calf, an ancient Egyptian symbol still beating in their hearts. Slavery was behind them, but it hadn't left them. They didn't want to wait. They didn't want to trust. Their inner fear demanded control, and the golden calf gave them exactly that, the illusion of tangible power at the cost of a spiritual covenant. When Moses saw it with his own eyes, something inside him shattered. Those tablets, written by the very finger of God, received amid cloud and flame, now slipped from his hands and shattered against the rocks of the valley. It wasn't just the covenant that broke. It was Moses' soul. He had interceded for that people, risked his life, endured their complaints, their doubts, their threats, and now all of it seemed discarded, thrown away by a moment of impatience. The spiritual obedience he had carried with such care found no echo in such fickle hearts. The man who once trembled at his calling now trembled with fury. He crushed the calf, ground it to dust, and made the guilty drink it. It wasn't just punishment. It was a desperate attempt to erase the betrayal. Moses didn't just see disobedience. He saw ingratitude, a people ready to trade the living God for a lifeless image every time fear shouted louder than faith. But then something even deeper happened. Moses climbed again, alone, not to receive commands, but to beg for mercy. The man who came down with glory now went back up with the people's guilt on his shoulders. If you will forgive their sin, forgive, but if not, blot me out of your book. It was an intercession that revealed what unshakable faith truly is. Not a shield against pain, but the willingness to carry the weight of others before God. Moses didn't ask for justice. He asked for forgiveness. And if the price was his own removal, he was ready to pay it. This kind of surrender is rare. It's the point where obedience merges with love, where the leader becomes a shepherd, where the prophet becomes a father. And God responded, not with condemnation, but with another chance. He told Moses to prepare new tablets, to climb once more, to begin again, because even when man breaks the covenant, God still desires to restore it. Moses learned there that the greatest miracles aren't in plagues or seas or fire. They are in the heart that returns, in the soul willing to start again, even after breaking what was sacred. That is the miracle in the impossible, that a man, though flawed, though frustrated, keeps climbing the mountain, keeps listening for the voice, keeps believing that God is not finished yet. The tablets were broken, so was the soul, but the faith still stood. Years had passed since the crossing of the sea, since the mountain, since the covenant was broken, then restored. Moses had led the people through deserts, wars, rebellions, and miracles. He taught them to listen to God, to trust His provision, to carry the ark, to honor the law. But now, standing before the promised land, the Lord said, "You will see the land, but you will not enter it." To human eyes, it looked like an unfinished mission, a wasted effort, a frustrating ending. But God sees differently. From the top of Mount Nebo, Moses beheld the promise, not with his feet but with his faith. He didn't need to enter, because he had already planted what would sustain generations. The people were ready. The path had been opened. The impossible had already been overcome. Moses died there. No monuments, no honors, no applause. But Scripture declares, since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Deuteronomy 34:10. The greatest legacy isn't what is seen, it's what remains, and the faith of Moses remains. He began in fear, but he finished in intimacy. He started hesitant, but ended eternal. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Someone you know is also trying to walk by faith and needs to hear this message. Share this video with someone facing the impossible. Be God's instrument to rekindle someone's courage today. And if at any moment you felt like this journey spoke directly to your life, subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications and leave a like, not for the numbers, but because faith must be shared, multiplied and strengthened. Here, every video is a spiritual crossing, and you are part of it. Now tell me in the comments, sincerely, at what moment in this story did your soul tremble, but your faith stood firm? I'll be reading every response.